Here at Milan Terrace, Stirling, there used to be a freestone quarry, which gave this area the informal name of Quarry Hill. But after 1902, it acquired other nicknames. Murder Hill, because that year an old man was done to death here, and Haunted Hill, because it was said his ghost lingered, unable to rest until his murderer was brought to justice. George Cullen was a native of Somerset in England. Born about 1820, he emigrated to South Australia in 1850. Like many others, news of lucrative finds on the Victorian goldfields lured him east in the 1850s, but he returned to South Australia and settled in the Adelaide Hills at Stirling in 1856. George and his wife Mary raised a family of 5. Elizabeth Ann, who never married, was born in 1859. Thomas, born in 1860, was a carter and gardener of Aldgate. Mrs. Mary Catherine Rayner of Mitcham, born in 1862. Robert, born in 1866, also worked as a carter and as a gardener. And Mrs. Emily Teresa Creek, born in 1871. Although George was a Protestant, his wife and children were Roman Catholics. After his death, his wife claimed George had converted to Catholicism in 1898, when he feared he was dying. A Mr. Fewster, who had known him for 40 years, remarked that Cullen was the roughest of rough diamonds. He often expressed himself in a very strong language, which Fewster put down to a lack of education. He was broad Somerset, and it was great fun to see him barracking at the local cricket matches. If a fieldsman missed the ball, he would roar out, "Why don't you stop the ball, like an old 'ooman?" said Fewster. Cullen used to sit alone on the fence at the Stirling Cricket Club, applauding and chaffing the players with vigour. Cullen's company wasn't sought, he concluded, mostly due to his use of bad language. But he was a very independent old man, and brought up his family when times were hard. In the early days of South Australia, he was often to be found harvesting in the Mount Barker area, the old way, with a scythe and sickle. He was considered honourable in business dealings, and well liked by local children. Other locals were not so keen on Cullen. One man said while his 2 sons were decent men, George was the total opposite, and scandalised his family, though in what manner was not said. However, on the 14th of May 1902, he was fined for drunkenness and indecent language. Cullen's wife left him around 1899 on account of his violence and bad language. He had struck her twice and blackened her eyes. In 1901 he took his daughter, Mrs. Creek, to court, alleging non-payment of interest on a sum of money he had loaned to her. She successfully defended herself by saying that she was providing for her mother, who lived with her. George had stayed with his wife at Mitcham for a couple of months before they had an argument, and split up again. On the 3rd of February 1902 he was again in court. This time he sued his eldest son Thomas for an assault while he was living at Thomas's house. That took place on the 29th of November 1901. Cullen was a large man for the time, being about 6 foot tall and weighing 17 stone. He was very strong in his prime, and liked to recount of the time when he carried a 200-pound bag of flour on his back for 2 miles, without once putting the burden down for a rest. When young he was a quick runner, and in his 30s ran 24 miles from Strathalbyn to Stirling through the hills, and managed to beat the mail coach, which had to stop twice to change horses. Even as an old man he retained his prowess. Only a year before, one of the younger quarrymen was having difficulty in lifting a stone onto his dray. Cullen said he'd have a go, and managed to move the stone without apparent effort. He had, however, injured his shoulder more recently. If reclining or sitting, he needed a walking stick to help himself raise up. He had bought real estate in the early days and made a decent profit, allowing himself to retire with money in the bank. Some land he purchased at Frueville for £33, he later sold for £300. He had £1,246 in his bank accounts in 1902, or the equivalent of nearly 200,000 Australian dollars in 2022, as well as owning about 800 acres of land. He never tired of speaking about his money, and publicans recalled him showing off rolls of banknotes in front of total strangers. Yet he was of a miserly disposition and usually spent very little of it. He only had about £5 or £6 at home, mostly in silver coins. Cullen's home was a small house on the side of a gentle slope, about a half a mile from the Stirling Hotel, built with stone from the adjacent quarry. There was an upper floor of 4 rooms and a lower level consisting of a kitchen and a bedroom. There was no interior connection between the two halves of the house. The lower rooms had a ceiling height of about 7 feet. There were also 2 iron sheds on the lower level. The family had formerly lived in what was later the lodge house of the Bagot estate, and then moved across the road to their new house when it was built. There were 7 acres of land attached to the house, the garden and an old apple orchard having fallen into neglect by this time. Some patches of native timber still stood nearby. An impressive laurel hedge towered over the front fence, with an archway cut into it for the front gate. The atmosphere was one of bucolic calm and peacefulness. On the opposite side of the road was the Bagot estate, of carefully tended gardens and gigantic pine trees. From May to September 1902, Cullen was living with one of his old friends, Eli Smith, at West Mitcham. He had come to seek reconciliation with his wife again, but she rebuked him. She left the same day and went to live with Robert at Stirling East. One warm day in September, he kept piling on wood in the fireplace, until Eli's wife asked him not to waste the wood. The next day he packed and abruptly left. He then returned to the Stirling house, which he had signed over to his son Robert several years before. This was done on the understanding that George retained the right to use the home during his lifetime, and received an annual rent of £26. George's wife moved to Thomas's at Aldgate when George moved in. After just a short time, father and son were in disagreement, and Robert took his family and moved into a rented home, a quarter-mile further down the gully, on the 6th of October. At this point, Robert ceased paying his father rent. In the quarry next to Cullen's house was a dilapidated hut in which swagmen would reside, and which they had named the boarding house. There were often 2 or 3 men at any time. Cullen would often spend time in the late morning chatting with these men. One of these was a man named Frederick Evan Williams. Others found the presence of the swaggies unappealing, and they were turned out on the excuse that the shanty was to be refurbished. At Cullen's invitation, Fred moved into his house for about 2 weeks. The swagman agreed to cook for them both, in addition to paying 1 shilling rent per week to sleep in a shed. He left on the 24th of November to take up employment at the Crafers Hotel. Cullen had spoken of engaging a woman to cook and clean for him, but never got around to hiring one. A man named Williams kept his cow in Cullen's paddock. Just before Christmas he went to Cullen to pay for pasturage. He was informed by Cullen at this time that the old man intended to sell the property and take a trip home to England. In addition, he said he was not going to leave his sons a penny in his will. George Young and Joseph Cooper were conversing with Cullen on the 21st of December, when Cullen said that he had made arrangements to go to Adelaide on the 23rd of December, and have a jolly good spree. It had not been unusual for Cullen to leave without telling anyone where he was going. Cullen was last seen alive on Christmas Eve 1902 at his home. George Bruce, a bread carter, last saw the old man on the 23rd of December. He called on the 26th and 27th, but received no answer either time, and assumed George had gone away. Cullen was seen by 3 people on the 24th of December. Mr. Fairhill, lodge-keeper at the McGarry estate, spoke to him in the morning. A coachman named Robert Kennedy saw him in his paddock, and then at 2 p.m. Frank Mitten saw him again in the paddock, but walking in the direction of his son Robert's house. Nobody admitted to seeing Cullen alive following the sighting by Mitten. On Christmas morning, Robert Cullen was told his father's residence was closed up, but as his father had spoken of going away, he didn't think much of it. Nevertheless, on Sunday, 28th of December, Robert and Joseph Cooper and 4 children went to the property. Not able to find anyone about, they left again. At some point during the Christmas season, Robert wrote to his brother-in-law, John Creek, at Mitcham, to ask if George had gone to stay there over the holidays. A labourer named David Zechariah was quite surprised that George did not show up at the Christmas Day cricket match, which he said he was going to attend when David spoke to him a few days before. On the 31st of December, Thomas's wife Maria sent her son Robert up to the house with 50 shillings interest owed on Thomas's loan. The 11-year-old boy returned and joked, "Grandfather says you can keep the money. He will make you a present of it." On New Year's Eve, Robert and a different friend visited the property, but the doors were still locked, nor was quiet. As they were about to leave, Thomas Cullen arrived as well. He had come to pay the interest on the £150 he had loaned. On New Year's Day, Robert, his wife, and their young children went to the house again seeking George. The same day, David Zechariah could detect a fetid smell when the breeze blew from the direction of the Cullen house. He remarked about it to Robert Cullen. "Can't you smell that terrible stink?" Robert replied, "I can't smell anything." Zechariah then said, "There must be something wrong with the old man." But Robert replied he didn't think so. His father had gone to town. 2 days later, on Friday, the 2nd of January 1903, Thomas returned, this time with his brother-in-law John Creek. This time the men noticed a foul odour coming from the kitchen area. Thomas poked a stick through the keyhole to check if the key was on the other side of the lock, but it was not. They consulted Robert's wife Margaret, who gave permission for them to break into the house. They went and explained the situation at Stirling West Police Station. Thomas said, "The old man's missing. I was over at the house just now. I put my nose to the window, and there was a nasty smell. I wish you would come over, as the house is all locked up." The men were sent back to the house, and Constable Schumann rode after them to Quarry Hill. The policeman found the door locked and the key missing. He checked the window and saw the bolt was tied with string. An enamelled dish that seemed to hold bloody water could be seen. Schumann broke a window pane to gain access. Once inside, he found the door leading to a bedroom off of the kitchen was locked. He found 2 keys, but neither fitted the door. Cullen and Creek were admitted, and the 3 men forced the bedroom door and discovered the body of George Cullen, dressed in only a singlet, which was pushed up around his neck, laying on the floor in an advanced state of decomposition. A bran bag and some bedclothes covered the head. When the constable lifted them, he saw that George Cullen had been battered to death. The skin around the lower face had gone, and the bones beneath could be seen to be fractured. The rest of the body was undamaged by violence. The walls were splashed with blood, as if Cullen had been chased around the room being bludgeoned by his killer as he died. One head wound alone seemed to have been caused by the axe. The body had appeared to have been shifted shortly after death, as blood stained the doorstep, and the body was found a few feet from the door. "The old fellow was very rough on me, and I'm sorry he met his death like this," said Thomas. Laying under the left shoulder, half concealed in clotted blood, was a small iron hammer. In the adjoining kitchen was an American-style axe, with its handle sawn short. Grey hairs and blood adhered to the blade of the axe, found on the floor underneath the lower of 2 corner shelves. It was on the top shelf that the bowl of bloody water sat, and on the floor was a blood-stained towel, apparently used by the killer in washing blood from their hands. Kitchen utensils had been used prior to death, and a flitch of bacon and some other foodstuffs were in the kitchen. Just inside the door, Schumann found a piece of a woman's apron string. In the bedroom was the box in which Cullen kept his papers and will. The key for it was nowhere to be found, however. There was little furniture in the house, the solitary chair having been homemade, the seat crafted from an old sign. When turned upside down, it could be read, "This land for sale. Apply George Cullen." There was also a bed and a table. Robert Cullen had taken most of the furniture when he and his family moved out. Small dents in the wall of the bedroom were discovered by a detective. The head of the hammer found under the body fitted the marks perfectly, suggesting someone had wielded the weapon in a frenzy, striking out wildly. Robert Cullen said the hammer and the axe were his. They must have been left behind when he moved out. With over a week's delay to finding the body and beginning an investigation, police had a difficult job to solve the mystery. Suspicion fell on the swagman who camped in the quarry, and police were on the lookout for suspicious characters, meaning someone looking down on their luck. Police guarded the property, with Constable Eaton once positioned there for 13 hours before being relieved. The murder was the main topic of conversation in the district, and the belief was the swagman, or somebody from Adelaide to whom Cullen had boasted about his money, were to blame. The discovery of the apron string caused some to speculate the assailant could have been a woman. Mounted Constable Walls was placed on duty at the house to keep sightseers away, camping outside from 9 p.m. until the following afternoon. Inside, the house was reeking with the stench of death. At about 3 p.m. on the 4th of January, the Deputy Coroner and Dr. Ramsay Smith arrived to conduct a post-mortem and inquest. A panel of 6 jurors were sworn in, and the group visited the room to see the body. All emerged with blanched faces and were keen to be away from the spot as soon as possible. The smell of decomposition was reckoned to be almost unbearable. The inquest was held at the Stirling police station. At the inquest, Tom Cullen said that all of the family were on good terms with George. His wife did not visit him, but they had met by chance 2 or 3 months earlier, at Tom's. George had been to the Adelaide hospital to have his injured shoulder treated. His father had no enemies, and he could not suggest who would have done the deed. The inquest was adjourned until the 13th of January. Once Ramsay Smith had finished with the body, it was handed over to the undertakers, or most of it. It was revealed during an inquiry into Dr. Ramsay Smith's behaviour with retaining human heads for study, held in September 1903, that he had severed Cullen's head and brought it back to Adelaide and stored it in the hospital, as part of his medico-legal duties, he claimed. A huge coffin was required for the burial, 7 feet in length and 20 inches by 19 inches. 7 men struggled to bear the weight of the varnished cedar casket, with black and bronze fittings and nameplate, from the house. It was driven to the Stirling cemetery in a furniture van for the burial in the late afternoon in a graveside burial service. Mary Cullen did not attend the funeral of her husband. She did not even have it confirmed to be murder until that day. John Creek had merely told her that George was dead. Then her grandson had told her that he had seen a newspaper placard which announced an old man had been murdered in the hills. When a reporter for the Advertiser newspaper visited her, it was reported that she bowed her head and muttered, "Then it really was murder. This is too awful. Too awful." She was a strong advocate of the swagman theory, saying she had often warned him he would be murdered for his money by talking so much when he drank, but that she never expected her words to come true. "It was somebody outside, there is no mistaking that," she declared emphatically. A further remark the newspaper alleged she made was denied in the coroner's court, as never having been said. By the 10th of January, a number of swagmen had been questioned and satisfied police they had nothing to do with the crime, but Fred had still not been traced. When the inquest recommenced on the 13th of January in the Stirling Institute, Robert Cullen was represented by his own lawyer, while another lawyer looked after the interests of the rest of the family. Tom Cullen was recalled and questioned further about the loan he had taken from his father. He informed the court it was taken out 8 or 9 years ago with no security. He paid 6% each January 1st and July 1st to his father. Sometimes his father would come to collect the money, other times Tom or Tom's son would take the money to George. Tom had taken it himself the last 2 times. The last time Tom saw his father was 3 months prior. When asked if it was a friendly meeting, Tom replied, "Not altogether friendly." "Did he leave you in anger?" the coroner continued. "Yes," replied Tom. "Do you recollect what he said?" "He said my house was a bad house." "Did you make any reply to that?" "No." Asked why he took the money to the house, Tom explained he didn't want his father coming down to his house. Tom admitted he may have spoken with Joseph Cooper and George Young on the 23rd, and learned that his father was going to the city for a drinking spree. He had heard before New Year's Day that was his father's plan. Tom said that on the 23rd of December he was at the nearby village of Mylor collecting wood and got home about 7 or 8 p.m. that night. The following day he took the load of wood to Hindmarsh, near Adelaide, to a lime burner's named Smith. He stopped at Olmeyer's butcher's shop in Wakefield Street and arrived home about 9 p.m. On Christmas Day he attended church in the morning and spent the rest of the day at home. The truth of the fight which had taken place between Tom and his father in 1901 was laid open. Although when he was sued by his father it was said it was over his father calling Tom's wife Mary a sow, in the coroner's court Tom revealed the truth. "He asked my wife to go into a room with him while I was away with a load of wood. When asked by the coroner if it was intimated that this was for a bad purpose, Tom confirmed it. Tom denied feeling anger toward his father because he did not want to be on bad terms with him, but he did not want him at his house. His father's lawyer had written to him demanding some furniture he claimed was to be turned over, he acknowledged. The furniture had been given to him by George when his parents separated. One of the many wills George had produced, dated 25th of January 1901, was shown to the court. In it, George had left £100 to his 9-year-old granddaughter, Tess, and provision for a fence and tombstone for himself. The rest of the estate was to go to Tom. Tom said he did not believe the will was valid, as it had not been stamped, when he was asked about the considerable interest he had in it. Also, he had heard another will in favour of Robert Cullen had since been made. He had not heard of any intention by his father to cut both of them out of the will. His brother, he said, had never said anything ill against George. Neither he nor Bob liked to have enmity toward anyone else. Asked if there had been any trouble over the property on Quarry Hill when George threatened to burn it down or blow it up, Tom replied no. His father had threatened to blow up Tom's house. The box in which George Cullen kept his papers had to be forced open as the key was never located. Only George's bank book was found inside. Missing were his will, deeds, and a deposit receipt for £1,000. Tom had seen the receipt about 18 months to 2 years earlier in the box. Bob Cullen also disclosed that the deeds missing from George's box were actually given to him by his father on the 17th of May 1902, while George's current will was discovered to be lodged with his lawyer in Mount Barker. Further information came to light on George Cullen moving back into the property he had given to Robert. His son had been to a lawyer, and a letter was drafted to be sent to George demanding he vacate the premises. In part, the letter, dated the 29th of September 1902, read, "We have been consulted by your son Robert with reference to your refusal to leave his house and premises at Stirling East. You are well aware of the reasons which compel him. For the sake of all concerned, it is better that we should not go into them in detail." Robert changed his mind and tried to have the letter destroyed before it reached his father, but it was delivered. George could not read or write, and so Constable Schumann, who had delivered the letter on the 13th of November 1902, read it out. George commented, "Those boys treated me damned badly. I'll sell the place and go to England. They shan't have a penny." Emily Teresa Creek, known as Teresa, the Cullens' youngest daughter, gave evidence that her mother, who lived with her, did not leave the house at West Mitcham at all between the 23rd of December and 31st of December 1902. Despite his ill treatment and use of bad language around their mother, everyone in the family tried to get along with George, she said. Archibald Litchfield, station master and savings bank agent at Aldgate, testified that George had withdrawn £6 in gold on the 3rd of December. He also gave evidence about a Syrian hawker, whom he described as seedy-looking, who had purchased a ticket to Adelaide on the 8 p.m. train on the 25th of December. He was certain the hawker paid with a gold coin. The next morning at 7:15 he found the same man shivering on the platform, who said he had slept in one of the carriages overnight. The porter said the man had returned on the midnight train. The mystery man left Aldgate on the 7:58 a.m. train. There was a good road between the station and Cullen's house, just under a mile away. Mary Rayner, the Cullens' middle daughter, had not seen her father since June 1902. He had a quick temper, she said, but was equally quick to forget and forgive, she said. Robert Cullen's lawyer made the comment that George used coarse language, especially in sexual matters. Margaret Cullen, Robert's wife, had spoken to Fred the swagman. He had told her that a woman had called at the house and spoke about buying it from George. She declined an offer to inspect the building, instead saying she would send her husband. Who she was remained unknown. She said Robert rarely went up to check on his father. She was unaware he had gone to the house on the 28th of December. George had not visited their house on the 24th of December, she said. When asked where he could have been headed when seen that day going toward their house, she said she did not know. Asked about the apron string found in the house, she said she didn't know how it came to be there, and it didn't match any of hers. When Robert Cullen gave evidence, he was asked about Fred, who he said looked respectable and not the type to murder anyone. As to his movements, Robert cut a load of wood at Chunga on the 22nd of December, returning home at about 10 p.m. He left for Adelaide the next day at 8 a.m. to deliver the wood and returned soon after 8 p.m. On the 24th of December he again cut wood at Echunga and arrived home at 8 p.m. On Christmas Day he went to church in the morning and remained at home the rest of the day. On the 26th of December he left his home at noon and loaded some wood 2 miles from his house and then returned home. He took the wood to Brompton near Adelaide on the 27th, leaving at 7 a.m. and returning home at 8 p.m. Finally, on the 15th of January, an alert Constable Bertram at Udunda heard of 3 strangers to the district and went to Bower to find them. One of the 3 swagmen was Fred. Asked about the murder, Fred said he had not heard about it, which his 2 companions confirmed. Fred had left Crafers on the 12th of December by train and gone to Port Adelaide. He stopped at the Sailors' Home for a few days, trying to find employment as a ship's cook, but to no avail. He then spent a week in Adelaide, before deciding to go up to the River Murray area fruit picking. He had walked the 78 miles to Salisbury and on through Gawler, Tanunda, Dutton and Neil's Flat, before reaching the Morgan Road, where he encountered the constable. Frederick Williams was a 36-year-old Welshman, who was anxious to assist if he could, although he could not think who would have murdered Cullen. He and Bertram walked 9 miles to the Sutherland Railway Station along a dusty road on a scorching hot day, with no breeze, to catch a train to the city. At the same time, news arrived that the Syrian seen at Aldgate had been identified as a Russian Pole, who had taken the train to Serviceton, Victoria. A fellow passenger said the man was affable and friendly. The inquest resumed after a 2-week break on the 29th of January, when the main witness was Fred. He said when he left Cullen's there were 3 men camped in the quarry, a man named Tom and a tinsmith and his assistant. He had not seen the axe at the house while he was there. Cullen used to saw his wood. At one time when he was in the quarry he had asked to borrow an axe, but Cullen had none to lend. With that, the hopes that the theory a swagman had been responsible evaporated. At the end of the inquest, the jury returned to their verdict. They found that George Cullen was brutally murdered on or about the 24th of December by some person or persons unknown. On the 3rd of February 1903, the South Australian State Government posted a reward of £100 for information about the murder. It was never collected. The mystery of who killed George Cullen remained unsolved. The police and newspapers had concentrated their expectations on the swagmen and seedy hawkers lurking about Stirling as being the solution to the crime, although even at the time some people were looking closer to home. Cullen was, it seems, in bed when he was attacked. It was said he always locked his doors at night, so who would he admit while half-dressed? Could one of the Cullen family have been responsible? There were a lot of legal proceedings taking place, which, despite the public show of solidarity, shows a very dysfunctional relationship between George and the rest of his family. Robert Cullen stood to gain in his father's will, but if he learnt that his father was intending to leave nothing, could an argument have ensued over money or the property? And what were the reasons which compelled Robert to seek to evict his father from the house just 3 months before the murder? Thomas Cullen had gotten into a physical fight over his father's behaviour towards Thomas's wife just over a year earlier. Could Thomas have been bearing a grudge? Considering the circumstances, it would not be unlikely. The hammer and the axe were both used in the murder. Were 2 people involved? Or did the hammer only injure and incapacitate Cullen, and the axe was used to make certain of his death? There was no evidence either man or anyone else in the family was responsible. No evidence against anyone was ever produced. George Cullen was probably suffering dementia, which caused him to act impulsively and at times inappropriately. Did his cantankerousness play a contributory factor in his murder? Or was it the impression he had large sums of money in his house which led to the tragedy? George's widow barely outlived her husband. Mary Cullen passed at the age of 69 on the 15th of October 1903. She and her eldest daughter Elizabeth, who died in 1907, were buried at West Terrace Cemetery. The other 4 children and the son-in-law John Creek all died in the years between 1945 and 1950. As for the local name Haunted Hill, there is little documentation on sightings of the ghost of George Cullen, but considering the man in life, it would surely be a spectacular phantom if he still walks abroad. The killer and his or her motives remain hidden in the dark corners of history.